Maya Washington sat quietly at her desk in the back corner of her seventh-grade classroom at Jefferson Middle School. The autumn morning light filtered through the tall windows as students chatted excitedly about their weekend plans. Mrs. Henderson had just announced that today's social studies lesson would focus on government careers, and she wanted each student to share what their parents did for work. Maya's stomach tightened as she listened to her classmates eagerly volunteer information. Tommy bragged about his father being a successful lawyer downtown. Sarah mentioned her mother's job as a hospital administrator. The room buzzed with energy as children competed to make their family sound the most important. When Mrs. Henderson's eyes landed on Maya, the quiet girl felt her cheeks grow warm. Maya had always been one of the quieter students in class. She kept to herself mostly, focusing on her studies and avoiding the drama that seemed to follow some of her more outgoing classmates. Her grades were excellent, but she rarely spoke up during class discussions. "Maya, dear, what about your parents? What do they do for work?" Mrs. Henderson asked, with what seemed like genuine interest. Maya straightened in her chair and spoke clearly. "My dad works at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. He's in charge of important military operations and helps keep our country safe." The classroom fell silent for a moment before erupting into snickers and whispers. Mrs. Henderson's expression shifted from curiosity to what looked like barely concealed annoyance. She had taught at Jefferson Middle School for over 15 years and prided herself on maintaining order in her classroom. She had little patience for what she perceived as attention-seeking behavior. "Maya, that's quite an imagination you have there," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice carrying a sharp edge that made several students look up from their notebooks. "But we're discussing real jobs that real parents have, not fantasy stories." The snickering grew louder. Jake Morrison, one of the more popular boys in class, turned around in his seat to face Maya. "Yeah, right, Maya. Your dad probably works at the gas station, not the Pentagon. Why are you always making stuff up?" Maya felt her face burning with embarrassment and anger. She wanted to defend herself, to tell them about the times her father had to travel for work, about the important phone calls he took even during dinner, about the medals and certificates hanging in his home office. But the words seemed stuck in her throat as more students joined in the mocking. "The Pentagon?" laughed Jessica, another popular girl who always seemed to have the latest clothes and gadgets. "Maya, that's where, like, super important military people work, not regular people's dads." Mrs. Henderson raised her hand to quiet the class, but the damage was already done. Maya could see the skeptical look in her teacher's eyes, the way she pursed her lips, as if she was dealing with a chronic liar. This wasn't the first time Maya had mentioned her father's work, and each time it was met with the same disbelief. "Class, please settle down," Mrs. Henderson said, though her tone suggested she found the situation more amusing than concerning. "Maya, perhaps you could tell us what your father actually does for work. We all want to learn about real careers." The emphasis on the word real hit Maya like a slap. She looked around the classroom at faces filled with smirks and rolled eyes. These were kids she had known since elementary school, yet none of them believed her. None of them thought someone like her could have a father in such an important position. Maya's voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke again. "He really does work there. He's a colonel in the Air Force, and he runs strategic planning operations. He graduated from the Air Force Academy and has served for 20 years. The laughter that followed was even louder than before. "Mrs. Bray." Henderson shook her head with visible frustration. "Maya, I think you've watched too many military movies. Let's be honest about our families, shall we? There's nothing wrong with having regular jobs. Not everyone can be a colonel or work at the Pentagon." Tommy raised his hand eagerly. "Mrs. Henderson, my dad says that people who work at the Pentagon are like the most important people in the whole military. They help the president and everything. There's no way Maya's dad works there." "Tommy's absolutely right," Mrs. Henderson agreed, nodding approvingly. The Pentagon is where our nation's top military leaders work. It's not a place where just anyone can get a job. Maya, I'm going to have to ask you to stop disrupting our lesson with these stories. Maya felt tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. She had never lied about her father's job, not once. Colonel Marcus Washington was indeed stationed at the Pentagon, where he served as a senior strategic planning officer. He had worked his way up through the ranks over 2 decades of distinguished service. But looking around at the faces of her classmates and teacher, Maya realized that none of that mattered to them. The rest of the class period passed in a blur. Students continued sharing about their parents' careers, but Maya noticed how differently Mrs. Henderson responded to each child. When wealthy students talked about their parents' prestigious jobs, she listened with interest and asked follow-up questions. When students from more modest backgrounds shared, she was polite but brief in her responses. When the bell finally rang for lunch, Maya gathered her books slowly, hoping to avoid the crowd of students who were sure to continue their mockery in the hallway. But her hopes were dashed as soon as she stepped out of the classroom. "Hey everyone, Maya's dad is a general or something," Jake announced loudly to the crowded hallway. "He probably knows the president personally too." The laughter followed Maya all the way to her locker. She fumbled with her combination as students walked by, some pointing and whispering, others outright laughing at what they saw as her ridiculous claims. Maya had always been proud of her father's service and accomplishments, but now that pride felt like a heavy burden. During lunch, Maya sat alone at her usual table in the corner of the cafeteria. She could hear fragments of conversations from nearby tables, and too often her name came up, followed by laughter. The sandwich her mother had packed for her sat untouched as she wondered why no one would believe her. The afternoon brought no relief. In her next class, word had already spread about Maya's lies regarding her father's job. Even teachers who hadn't been present during the morning incident seemed to look at her with suspicion, as if she might start telling tall tales at any moment. Maya had always been a good student, but as the day wore on, she found it impossible to concentrate on her lessons. The constant whispers and stares made her feel like she was under a microscope. By the time the final bell rang, she was exhausted from the emotional toll of the day. As Maya walked toward the school exit, she overheard Mrs. Henderson talking to another teacher in the hallway. "Some of these kids just have such active imaginations," Mrs. Henderson was saying. "They'll say anything for attention. I had a student today claiming her father works at the Pentagon, of all places, as if any of our students' parents would have that kind of job." The other teacher laughed knowingly. "Oh, I know the type. They watch too much TV and think they can impress everyone with these elaborate stories about their families." Maya hurried past them, her cheeks burning with fresh humiliation. She couldn't understand why her teacher and classmates found it so impossible to believe that someone like her could have a father in an important military position. Was it because of how she looked? Was it because of where she lived? Was it because her family didn't drive the fanciest cars or wear the most expensive clothes? That evening at dinner, Maya pushed her food around on her plate while her parents discussed their respective days at work. Colonel Washington had just returned from a 3-day conference at the Pentagon, where he had been briefing senior officials on upcoming strategic initiatives. Her mother, Dr. Angela Washington, talked about her research at the local university's biochemistry department. "How was school today, sweetheart?" her father asked, noticing Maya's unusual quietness. Maya looked up at her father, taking in his kind eyes and the graying temples that spoke of years of dedicated service. She thought about telling him what had happened, about how her teacher had humiliated her in front of the entire class. But she couldn't bring herself to burden him with the cruel words that had been thrown at her. "It was fine, Dad," she said softly. "Just a regular day." But it hadn't been a regular day at all. It had been a day that changed something fundamental in Maya's understanding of how the world saw her and her family. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling of her modest bedroom, Maya wondered if tomorrow would bring more of the same humiliation and disbelief. The next few weeks at Jefferson Middle School became increasingly difficult for Maya. What had started as a single incident in Mrs. Henderson's classroom had snowballed into something much larger and more painful. Word of Maya's Pentagon lie had spread throughout the 7th grade, and soon even older students knew about the girl who supposedly had a father working in one of the most secure buildings in America. Maya tried to keep her head down and focus on her schoolwork, but the constant mockery made it nearly impossible. During science class, when students were discussing their career aspirations, someone would inevitably make a joke about how Maya's dad could get them a job at the Pentagon. In the cafeteria, students would salute her mockingly when she walked by with her lunch tray. Mrs. Henderson seemed to take particular pleasure in the ongoing situation. During her social studies classes, she would occasionally make pointed comments about the importance of honesty and how telling lies only hurt the liar in the end. Her eyes would always drift to Maya when she said these things, causing the other students to turn and stare as well. "The Pentagon is an incredibly secure facility," Mrs. Henderson explained during one lesson about government buildings. "Only the most qualified and distinguished military personnel are stationed there. It's not a place where ordinary people work." Again, her gaze found Maya, and the message was clear to everyone in the room. Maya's academic performance began to suffer. She had always been an excellent student, consistently earning A's and B's across all subjects. But the constant stress and humiliation were taking their toll. She found herself unable to concentrate during lessons, her mind wandering to thoughts of why people couldn't believe her family was capable of distinction and success. The situation reached a new low when Maya was assigned to work on a group project about military history. None of her classmates wanted to be in her group, claiming they didn't want to work with someone who made up stories about the military. Maya ended up working alone on what was supposed to be a team assignment, spending hours in the library researching and writing, while her classmates enjoyed the social aspect of collaborative work. During one particularly painful lunch period, Maya overheard a conversation at the table behind her. 3 girls from her grade were discussing the upcoming school dance and what they would wear. "My mom is taking me dress shopping this weekend at the mall," said one girl excitedly. "That's so cool. My dad said he'd give me extra allowance for a really nice dress," replied another. "Well, Maya doesn't need to worry about money," chimed in the third girl with obvious sarcasm. "Her dad works at the Pentagon, remember? He probably makes like $1 million a year and knows all the generals." The laughter that followed was sharp and cruel. Maya felt her appetite disappear completely. She wrapped up the remainder of her lunch and threw it away, walking quickly out of the cafeteria to avoid hearing any more of their comments. The mockery wasn't limited to her peers. Maya began to notice that some teachers treated her differently as well. When she raised her hand in class, they would sometimes ignore her or give her shorter responses than they gave other students. When she turned in assignments, she occasionally caught them looking at her work with skeptical expressions, as if they were checking for more lies or exaggerations. One afternoon, Maya's English teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, assigned a creative writing piece about family heroes. Maya spent hours crafting a heartfelt essay about her father's military service, his dedication to protecting the country, and the sacrifices he made for his work. She wrote about the late-night phone calls, the times he missed family dinners because of urgent meetings, and the pride she felt knowing he was making a difference in national security. When Mr. Rodriguez returned the essays the following week, Maya was shocked to see a C- at the top of her paper. At the bottom, he had written, "Interesting creative fiction, but the assignment asked for a real family hero. Please stick to factual accounts in future assignments." Maya stared at the grade in disbelief. She had poured her heart into that essay, sharing genuine experiences and real emotions about her father's career. To have it dismissed as creative fiction felt like another punch to the stomach. She looked around at her classmates' papers and noticed that most had received much higher grades, even though many were clearly less detailed and thoughtful than her own work. The breaking point came during a school assembly about Veterans Day. The principal had invited a local veteran to speak to the students about military service and its importance to the community. Maya sat in the auditorium, excited to hear someone speak positively about military careers for once. The veteran, a retired Army sergeant, talked about his experiences serving overseas and the honor of protecting American freedoms. When he opened the floor for questions, Maya's hand shot up immediately. She wanted to ask about the Pentagon and whether he had ever worked with people stationed there. But before she could even speak, she heard snickering from the rows around her. Students began whispering loudly enough for others to hear. "Oh no, Maya's going to tell him about her Pentagon dad, and here we go again with the stories." The veteran called on another student instead, and Maya slowly lowered her hand, feeling the familiar heat of embarrassment wash over her face. She spent the rest of the assembly staring at her shoes, unable to focus on the speaker's words. That afternoon, Maya finally broke down in the bathroom. She locked herself in a stall and let the tears flow freely, no longer able to hold back the weeks of accumulated hurt and frustration. She couldn't understand why everyone was so determined to believe she was lying. Her father was a good man who had worked hard his entire career to serve his country. Why was that so difficult for people to accept? When Maya got home that evening, her mother immediately noticed her daughter's red-rimmed eyes and dejected posture. Dr. Washington was a perceptive woman who had earned her Ph.D. in biochemistry through years of dedication and hard work. She had faced her own challenges and skepticism throughout her career, and she recognized the signs of someone dealing with unfair treatment. "Maya, honey, what's wrong?" she asked gently, sitting down beside her daughter on the living room couch. At first, Maya tried to brush off her mother's concerns, insisting that everything was fine, but Dr. Washington persisted with patient questioning, and eventually the whole story came pouring out. Maya told her mother about the classroom incident, about Mrs. Henderson's public humiliation, about the constant mockery from classmates, and about how even her teachers seemed to think she was a liar. Dr. Washington listened with growing anger and dismay. She had always known that her family might face skepticism or prejudice in certain situations, but she had hoped that Maya's school would be a safe environment where her daughter could thrive academically and socially. Hearing about the systematic way Maya was being treated filled her with a protective fury. "Maya, I want you to know that you have done absolutely nothing wrong," Dr. Washington said firmly. "Your father's career is something to be proud of, and you should never feel ashamed for telling the truth about our family." Maya nodded, but her mother could see the deep hurt in her daughter's eyes. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. Weeks of humiliation had damaged Maya's confidence and sense of belonging at school. Something needed to be done to address the situation, but Dr. Washington knew she needed to discuss it with her husband before taking action. That evening, after Maya had gone to bed, Dr. Washington told Colonel Washington about everything their daughter had been enduring. She watched as her husband's jaw tightened with anger, and his military bearing became even more pronounced. Colonel Marcus Washington had spent 20 years serving his country with distinction, earning respect and recognition from colleagues across all branches of the military. The idea that his daughter was being humiliated because people couldn't believe he held an important position filled him with indignation. "I think it's time I paid a visit to Maya's school," Colonel Washington said quietly, his voice carrying the authority that came from years of military leadership. "This has gone on long enough." Dr. Washington nodded in agreement. They had tried to let Maya handle the situation on her own, hoping it would blow over naturally. But it had become clear that intervention was necessary. Their daughter deserved to attend school without facing constant humiliation and disbelief about her family. As they made plans for Colonel Washington to visit Jefferson Middle School, Neither parent could have predicted just how dramatically things were about to change for Maya and everyone who had doubted her story. Colonel Marcus Washington arrived at Jefferson Middle School on a crisp Thursday morning, wearing his full dress uniform complete with ribbons, medals, and insignia that told the story of his distinguished military career. He had taken leave from his duties at the Pentagon specifically to address the situation that had been causing his daughter so much pain. The silver eagles on his collar caught the morning sunlight as he walked through the school's front entrance with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command. The school secretary, Mrs. Patterson, looked up from her desk as the imposing figure approached. Her eyes widened as she took in the sight of the decorated military officer standing before her. She had worked at Jefferson Middle School for 12 years and had never seen anyone quite like Colonel Washington enter their building. "Good morning, ma'am," Colonel Washington said with polite formality. "I'm Colonel Marcus Washington, and I'd like to speak with Principal Johnson about my daughter, Maya Washington. I believe there are some issues that need to be addressed immediately." Mrs. Patterson stammered slightly as she reached for the phone to call the principal's office. She couldn't help but notice the array of medals and decorations on the colonel's uniform, including several she recognized as being awarded only for exceptional service and valor. This was clearly not an ordinary parent coming for a routine conference. Principal Johnson appeared within minutes, having been alerted by his secretary that a high-ranking military officer was requesting a meeting. Richard Johnson had been running Jefferson Middle School for 8 years, and he prided himself on maintaining good relationships with parents and the community. However, he had never dealt with a situation quite like this. "Colonel Washington, it's an honor to meet you," Principal Johnson said, extending his hand for a firm handshake. "I understand you'd like to discuss your daughter, Maya. Please come into my office." As they walked down the hallway, several students and teachers stopped to stare at the uniformed officer. Word began to spread quickly through the school that Maya Washington's father was actually at the school, and he was definitely in the military. Students whispered excitedly to each other, many beginning to realize that maybe Maya hadn't been lying after all. In Principal Johnson's office, Colonel Washington took a seat across from the principal's desk and got straight to the point. "Sir, I'm here because my daughter has been subjected to weeks of humiliation and mockery by both students and staff at this school. She has been repeatedly called a liar for accurately describing my career and service to this country." Principal Johnson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had not been aware of any specific incidents involving Maya Washington, but he was beginning to sense that this was a serious situation that had somehow escaped his attention. "I'm very sorry to hear that, Colonel Washington. Could you provide me with some specific details about what has been happening to Maya?" Colonel Washington proceeded to outline everything Maya and his wife had told him about the classroom incident with Mrs. Henderson, the ongoing mockery from students, the way teachers had been treating Maya's assignments and participation, and the overall hostile environment his daughter had been forced to endure. "Furthermore," Colonel Washington continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to briefing senior officials, "I'd like to clarify a few facts about my service record, since there seems to be some confusion about whether someone like me could actually work at the Pentagon." He pulled out a folder containing his service record, security clearances, and current assignment orders. Principal Johnson's eyes grew wider as he reviewed the documents. Colonel Washington was indeed assigned to the Pentagon, where he served as a senior strategic planning officer in the Air Force's Operations Directorate. His clearance level was higher than most people could imagine, and his list of commendations and medals reflected a career of exceptional service. "As you can see," Colonel Washington said calmly, "my daughter has been telling the absolute truth about my career. I find it deeply concerning that the adults in this building chose to humiliate a child rather than consider that she might actually be accurate in her statements about her family." Principal Johnson felt his stomach drop as he realized the magnitude of the situation. Not only had his school been mistreating the daughter of a highly decorated military officer, but they had been doing so based on assumptions and prejudices rather than facts. This was exactly the kind of incident that could damage the school's reputation and potentially result in serious consequences. Colonel Washington, I am truly sorry that Maya has experienced this treatment at our school. This is absolutely unacceptable, and I want to address it immediately. Would you be willing to speak with Mrs. Henderson directly? Within minutes, Mrs. Henderson was called to the principal's office. She entered the room expecting a routine meeting, but stopped short when she saw Colonel Washington in his dress uniform. The blood drained from her face as she began to comprehend what was happening. Mrs. Henderson, Principal Johnson began, I'd like you to meet Colonel Marcus Washington, Maya's father. Mrs. Bies. Henderson stood frozen in the doorway, unable to speak. The reality of her mistake was hitting her with full force. She had not only humiliated a student in front of the entire class, but she had done so while mocking the service and sacrifice of a genuine American hero. Colonel Washington stood and faced the teacher who had caused his daughter so much pain. His voice was controlled, but carried an unmistakable edge of disapproval. Mrs. Henderson, I understand you've been teaching my daughter that her family is dishonest and that her father's service to this country is somehow fictional. I had no idea, Mrs. Henderson stammered, her face flushing with embarrassment and shame. Maya never provided any proof, and it just seemed so unlikely that— That what exactly? Colonel Washington interrupted. That a black family could have a parent in a position of responsibility and authority? That someone who looks like my daughter couldn't possibly come from a family with military distinction? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Mrs. Henderson realized that her assumptions had been based on prejudices she hadn't even fully acknowledged to herself. She had automatically assumed that Maya was lying, not because of any evidence, but because she couldn't imagine that a quiet black girl from a modest background could have a father serving at one of the most important military installations in the world. Principal Johnson cleared his throat and took control of the conversation. Mrs. Henderson, I think it would be appropriate for you to apologize to Colonel Washington and to make arrangements to apologize to Maya and her class for the way this situation was handled. Of course, Mrs. Henderson said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. Colonel Washington, I am deeply sorry for my behavior and for the way I treated Maya. There is no excuse for what I did. Colonel Washington nodded curtly, but did not immediately accept the apology. Mrs. Henderson, my daughter looks up to her teachers. She trusted you to treat her with fairness and respect. Instead, you chose to humiliate her in front of her peers and dismiss her family's service to this country. I hope you understand the impact your actions have had on a 12-year-old girl. The weight of his words was evident in Mrs. Henderson's expression. She had spent years teaching students about respect, honesty, and integrity, yet she had failed to demonstrate those very qualities when it mattered most. Principal Johnson then made arrangements for Colonel Washington to address Maya's class directly. Word had already spread throughout the school that Maya's father was actually at the building, and students were buzzing with curiosity and, in some cases, growing embarrassment about their own behavior. When Colonel Washington entered Mrs. Henderson's classroom, the room fell completely silent. Students who had spent weeks mocking Maya's claims were now faced with undeniable proof that she had been telling the truth all along. The uniform, the medals, the bearing of a career military officer. Everything about Colonel Washington's presence confirmed what Maya had been saying from the beginning. Good morning, students, Colonel Washington said, his voice carrying easily through the classroom. I'm Colonel Marcus Washington, Maya's father, and I understand there has been some confusion about my career and service. He spent the next 20 minutes talking about his work at the Pentagon, his responsibilities in strategic planning, and the importance of military service to national security. Students listened in rapt attention, many of them beginning to realize the significance of having dismissed Maya's truthful statements. "I want you all to understand something important," Colonel Washington continued. "My daughter Maya has been completely honest about our family. She has never lied to you or exaggerated about my service. The fact that some of you found her truthfulness difficult to believe says more about your assumptions than it does about Maya's character." Jake Morrison, who had been one of Maya's most persistent tormentors, raised his hand tentatively. "Sir, I'm really sorry for not believing Maya. I didn't know that I didn't realize that people who look like my family could serve in important positions." Colonel Washington finished the thought gently but firmly. "Son, this is exactly why it's important never to make assumptions about what people are capable of achieving. My daughter deserves the same respect and belief that you would give to any other student in this classroom." When Maya entered the classroom for her next period, she was shocked to find her father standing at the front of the room. Students who had mocked her for weeks were now looking at her with expressions ranging from shame to newfound respect. Mrs. Henderson approached her desk with obvious discomfort. "Maya," Mrs. Henderson said quietly, "I owe you a sincere apology. I was wrong to doubt you and wrong to treat you the way I did. Your father is clearly a distinguished service member, and you have every right to be proud of him." Maya looked around the classroom at her classmates, many of whom were also offering their own apologies. Jake Morrison stood up and walked over to her desk. "Maya, I'm really sorry for making fun of you. Your dad is actually really cool, and I was a jerk for not believing you." One by one, other students followed suit, approaching Maya to apologize for their behavior. The girl, who had been isolated and mocked for weeks, suddenly found herself surrounded by classmates who were eager to make amends for their treatment of her. Colonel Washington watched his daughter navigate this moment of vindication with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout her ordeal. He felt a surge of pride, not just in his own service, but in the strength and character his daughter had demonstrated in the face of adversity. As the school day continued, word of Colonel Washington's visit spread throughout Jefferson Middle School. Teachers who had questioned Maya's honesty sought her out to apologize. Students who had participated in the mockery made efforts to include her in conversations and activities. The girl who had been branded a liar was now recognized as someone who had simply been telling the truth about her extraordinary family. Principal Johnson called an emergency meeting with his staff that afternoon to address the broader issues raised by the incident. "This situation has highlighted some serious problems with how we approach our students and their families," he told the assembled teachers. "We cannot allow our assumptions and prejudices to influence how we treat children in our care." Mrs. Henderson was required to write a formal letter of apology to both Maya and her parents, and to participate in additional training on cultural sensitivity and bias recognition. The incident became a catalyst for broader conversations about equity and inclusion at Jefferson Middle School. For Maya, the experience was transformative in unexpected ways. While the weeks of mockery had been painful, the ultimate vindication gave her a new sense of confidence and self-worth. She realized that telling the truth and standing by her family was always the right choice, even when others chose not to believe her. Colonel Washington's visit to the school became legendary among the students. Many would remember it as the day they learned not to judge others based on assumptions or appearances. Maya, who had been seen as an outsider and a liar, was now viewed with respect and admiration. The incident also strengthened the bond between Maya and her father. She had always been proud of his service, but seeing how he stood up for her and defended her honor gave her an even deeper appreciation for the man he was, both as a soldier and as a parent. Years later, Maya would look back on this experience as a defining moment in her young life. It taught her that integrity and truth would always prevail, even when the path was difficult. And it showed her that sometimes the most powerful response to doubt and mockery was simply the quiet dignity of standing by the truth.